He stood upon the icy slopes like a crimson statue, the light of the rising sun illuminating the armor he wore that made it glimmer. A sword rested at his side, its blade coated with a thin layer of blood, and yet it still shone brilliantly, as if the sword were meant to be in this state. Victorious. Yet this sword of his was not his first, nor was it his first to taste victory. In fact, Aurelius, as he stared out at the sun, reminisced about his younger days, the days when he commanded 100 souls himself, the days he and his comrades, his brothers in arms, tasted victory along with him. Aurelius Pio, in the ranks of the Empire, was once the centurion of the 7th Legion, known as the Phoenix Wing, they were called, for no matter the odds, even in the face of death, the 7th would always rise from the fire like a crimson bird born from the ashes, and its commander, Aurelius, was the pride of their legion. A centurion of no small skill, he was sent on various battles in so many campaigns. Campaigns against the barbarians of the north and the cults of the south. Aurelius was beloved by the Roman Empire, and he was honored to command the Phoenix Wing. It was in his 20th year that the Roman Empire was called to war once again. A great threat was amassing in the north. Warriors from a rival empire to the farthest east were rallying and preparing an invasion of the neighboring country of Heathmore. While Ashfeld had once been a part of Rome, it was now home to its own kings and lords. But with that being said, it wouldn't do for Heathmore and Ashfeld to fall to these savages of the east, known as the Wu Lin. A great battle would take place north of Heathmore. The legions of Rome would engage the Wu Lin forces, and the 7th Legion was called to join the battle. The Battle of the Amber Fields, they called it. The Empress Valeria Domna had planned a brilliant strategy to overwhelm the Wu Lin. Though their numbers were great, they would not overtake Roman strength easily. The Phoenix Wing would position itself on the far right flank to encircle and close the trap on the Wu Lin, and the battle, so far, was going smoothly. The Chinese had engaged the central force of the legions and were locked in combat. Aurelius was given the command and began to make his move. His sentry began its march towards the right side of the Wu Lin forces until he noticed it. Had it not been for the distinct change in the light of the sun on the mountain slopes, he wouldn't have seen it, but he could see it now. Movement. A cavalry force of over 2,000 Wu Lin warriors, led by a man with a long beard and flowing blue cape behind him. It was the Blue Dragon Corps, an elite unit of the Wu Lin forces, and undoubtedly led by the Zhongjun Tian Qilong, the Blue Dragon. They were set to crash into the side of the legion. It was a brilliant maneuver. If Aurelius moved his forces to trap the Wu Lin, then the central forces of the Roman line would be exposed to a crushing cavalry charge. But if Aurelius stayed to hold off the Blue Dragons, then the trap wouldn't be sprung and the Wu Lin flank would be free to continue supporting the central line. Aurelius cursed and signaled the Empress to warn her of the coming danger. He needed instruction. He needed her orders. But Empress Valeria was distracted by the main fighting. She couldn't see his signal. Aurelius had to make a choice, and so he made it. Aurelius pulled out to meet the Blue Dragons, and the battle turned far more ferocious. It was all a blur. The Phoenix clashed with the dragon, and steel met armor, flesh and shield. Screams mixed with roars of rage. Fire engulfed his world, and pain resonated with anger. More than once Aurelius crossed blades with the dragon himself, Zhilong. His skill was precise, deadly, and perfect. Aurelius could feel it was each time they exchanged blows, that this is what it meant to face greatness, to battle with one of the best. But Aurelius was not to be outdone. "Brace! All legions brace!" Aurelius turned at this command and saw the very thing he feared. His failure to close the trap gave the flank of the Wu Lin an opening that they were now taking. They charged fast and viciously into the 9th Legion and the 11th Legion. Cursing, he couldn't go back to aid them until he repelled the dragons. "Rise!" Aurelius bellowed. "Rise and push forward!" A mighty call, and the Phoenix Wing answered with a will. Aurelius looked and found him, Zhilong cutting down one of his own soldiers. With a roar, he leapt at him, but the dragon coiled around and struck back. The two danced with death and steel, sang. "Long Fei Zijian!" Jingluo snapped. Aurelius didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't care. He couldn't be bothered. He snapped back with a counter of his own. Etiam! The two rushed at each other, and they were lost in a world of blood, crimson in rage, until he missed a crucial blow. Xilong knocked his fist aside with his polearm and then grabbed him by the throat. Aurelius snarled defiantly back at him. "So falls the phoenix," Xilong hissed before slashing across his chest. Aurelius roared in pain, and his vision faded to red and black. The scent of ash and fire mixed in his nostrils, and Aurelius coughed and hacked as he opened his eyes. He lay there, staring up at the cold, gray sky as rain began to fall gently, pattering down upon his face. He groaned, attempting to sit up, and yelped in agony as he felt a vicious gash across his chest. His armor had been torn open by the dragon, but like a phoenix, he was rising. He looked around to see if the battle still raged, only for his heart to sink. The fields were littered with corpses as far as he could see. Smoke and fire pocked the land like trees, and faces etched in pain and misery were all that comforted him. Around him lay the bodies of hundreds, thousands, and so many of them his own soldiers. He grimaced and tried to grab for his gladius, only to lift a broken sword. He stared at his precious blade, broken down the middle, a useless handle connected to a hunk of steel no longer capable of doing what was necessary to win him victories. He tossed the useless weapon aside and clambered to his feet shakily. Staggering along the battlefield, he discovered dead Romans, dead Wulin. Some men he knew, many he did not. He searched tirelessly for the blue dragon himself, but Tian Xilong was nowhere to be found, and with each soldier of his own legion he found, his heartache grew. His men had tasted defeat, his legion had tasted defeat, and his broken blade and armor were the evidence. Aurelius began taking count of men under his command, counting up the bodies, but as he went around his search, he noticed some heads were unaccounted for. Were there survivors? Suddenly a thought occurred to Aurelius. They were too far from Rome for survivors to make it back on foot. There was only one place survivors might have gone. Ashfeld. It may not have belonged to Rome any longer, but they still spoke the tongue of the educated, and thus they might aid him, and by extension, his men. He patched himself up as best he could and began his travel, the long and painful walk through the hills into Ashfeld fields. Upon crossing those hills, Aurelius discovered the first Ashfeld fortress along his path, a city called Crow's Peak. There he saw a strange sight. A mob of barbarians adorned in fur and leather hide, carrying axes with unshaven faces, were howling like wolves as they assaulted the front of the castle. Battling them back was a host of men in heavy metal armor that even put his former wares to shame. They fought with longer blades and polearms to fend off the barbarians, but their numbers were few. Among the shouts and cries he heard the metalmen speaking Latin. They were the Ashfeldians, there was no doubt about it. So, they had not fallen too far. Staggering towards the fighting, he saw something shimmering out of the corner of his eye. A fallen sword of what appeared to be bloody gold. A sword that reminded him of his old. A sword that demanded to taste victory. He grabbed the sword off the ground and it felt right. It felt tremendous. The savage barbarian with a huge axe didn't even see him approach until he felt the blade cleave his head from his shoulders. The barbarians finally noticed him and turned their attention on him. "Yes! Come at me, savages!" he snarled. "Come and reap your reward!" Though injured, he lacked none of his former ferocity and skill. Aurelius had tasted defeat, and he would not taste it again. Axes were not the same as swords in how they looked or sounded or felt. Instead of steel singing in the air, the heavy whistle of wood and iron swishing told Aurelius where the next blow would come and how to respond to it. It was strange not having a hand or shield, or at least an available fist to punch, but the sword he wielded made up for this difference in fighting style. Blood sprayed his face, and he heard the savages scream in bitter agony as they were cut down one after the other. When the roar of battle finally ended, the barbarians had turned tail and run, but the few armored men that remained stood awestruck. He turned to them and then saluted, hand over his chest. "I am Centurion Aurelius Pio of the 7th Legion of the glorious Roman Empire. Tell me, where am I? And have you seen others like me?" To his delight and his relief, Aurelius did indeed find 4 of his lost soldiers. The young men were overjoyed to see the centurion alive, and tears were shed as the comrades embraced each other. But there was no time for celebration. Aurelius needed information quickly and demanded to speak to the Lords of Crow Peak. After receiving an audience with Lords Killian and Lady Amelia, he sat down with his men to hear all about their current situation. The news was a great deal for Aurelius to process. They explained to him the history and circumstance in which he now found himself. To his surprise, Ashfeld had forgotten all about the Roman Empire to their west, believing it only to be a legend, or an ancient thing. The land of Heathmore, as it was known, was home to 3 warring groups: the Knights, once vassals of Rome, the barbarian Vikings of the north, and the mysterious samurai of the east. Those barbarians he'd fended off were a recent incursion of the Warborn clan, the dominant clan in Valkenheim. 4 years ago, a warlord named Apollyon had escalated a massive civil war in Heathmore, rekindling the fires of war, and now all smaller towns and villages like Crow's Peak were targets for raiding and theft from the Vikings. The Lord and Lady offered Aurelius a position in their garrison to command and lead their forces. Requesting time to consider this, Aurelius led his men to the barracks they had been given. There, he spoke to his men in secret. "You 4 must return to Rome with haste. Learn what has become of our home." "But, sir," one replied, "aren't you to come with us?" "No," he answered. "I will remain here." "But, Commander," Aurelius gave a somber sigh of defeat and shook his head. "I could not find our eagle standard amongst the bodies of our fellows," he answered. This news rocked his men to their core. Every century in the Roman Empire held their eagle standard sacred. To lose it was a great insult and dishonor to the Legion. As such, I cannot return to Rome shamed in this way. You 4 return. I will remain in exile until such a time as I can find a new purpose. "Then accept the offer of this Crow's Peak," his men said gladly. "They would benefit from your assistance." "I will lead no longer," he answered. "When the Phoenix Wing did not rise from the ashes of defeat, I knew that I would never command again. However, I do not believe I am through fighting." Seeing as he could not be persuaded, his men took their leave and returned to Rome, leaving Heathmore and their commander behind. Aurelius remained in the care of the Lord and Lady of Crow's Peak, while they forged him new armor to replace his broken one. Made with the finest of materials and ornated to emulate the great phoenix wing that he stood proudly with, Aurelius discarded his centurion helm in place of a new one. He was a centurion no more. But what was he? This armor and this weapon were those of a Warden, or an order of warriors who took oaths to defend Ashfeld and her people. But could Aurelius defend this new land? Was Ashfeld his new home? He didn't have that answer yet, and so he would not take any oaths. Not yet. He remained in Crow's Peak a while longer to train, to study the way of his new sword and armor until he was comfortable in them. When barbarians attacked, he was there ready to fight them. When celebrations were held, he was always in attendance. Aurelius did all he could to understand the differences between his old home and this place. After a full year of living in Crow's Peak, Aurelius was met with a shocking discovery. News of centurions appearing throughout Ashfeld, lending their services to knight legions. Rome had come to Ashfeld. But why? What had befallen Rome? Swiftly he took horse and rode to the nearest legion garrison of the Golden Legion to find if the rumors were true. When he searched, he discovered them. A centurion clad in golden armor and a crest upon his head. The insignia on his pauldron marked him as a member of the 10th Legion. Though not a centurion when he knew him, this man wore the standard of one now. "Atticus!" Aurelius cried. Atticus turned, his black eyes finding Aurelius. When their eyes met, Atticus's face went pale and his eyes widened. "It can't be! You yellow bastard!" Aurelius laughed, clapping Atticus on the shoulder. "Commander Aurelius! You're actually alive! But the blue dragons broke the back of the Phoenix Wing. We saw you fall at the hand of Silong!" Atticus cried. "Indeed," Aurelius growled. "I will never forget it. I fell that day with my men, but I have been reborn here. I've been staying in Crow's Peak, Atticus, for a year now, but I've heard nothing from Rome. What's become of our home? What of the Empress? What is the fate of Rome?" Atticus grimaced and looked away. "We defeated the Wulin, brother. We sent them back to their wretched country, bloody and beaten, but we could not consider it a victory. Our losses were beyond the point of grief or counting. And Empress Valeria was She was betrayed. She was what? A plague has claimed Rome, Atticus explained. A wretched sickness that has driven the city to sheer desperation. 1 in every 6 who contract it die, and the dead were piled as high as a 3-story building. Valeria did all she could to try and change things. She tried to save Rome, but Aurelius, her inner circle lost faith in her. So the Praetorian, then? Aurelius snarled back. Atticus nodded. Yes, the Praetorian. When she returned, they attempted to assassinate her in her chambers. She escaped, but... He didn't need to say more. The Praetorian were the elite guard of the Emperor, but they were infamous for their treachery. The losses due to the Wulin must have broken their faith in Valeria already. Add on to that a plague? No wonder they acted the way they had. Well, where is she now? Aurelius asked. We are not sure, but she left us marching orders. Surviving soldiers are to head east, and her phrase was, uphold the future. What? Uphold the future? It was the only order she left, the final imperial decree. So we marched here to Ashfeld, and now we stand beside that order. Us and every other centurion who draws breath stand with Ashfeld. I see, Aurelius added. So she believes that Ashfeld is our future. Won't you join, brother? Atticus asked. They are giving us all command of special squads and units within legions. I'm sure we could rebuild the Phoenix Wing under your... No, Aurelius replied. No, forgive me, brother, but I will never command again. My days as a centurion are done. I will fight, but not as a commander of men. Atticus nodded somberly. Yes, you're not the only comrade I've met who thought as such. Ashfeld is beautiful, but it isn't quite home, is it? Hard to swear loyalty to a place that we barely know, I suppose. Aurelius didn't answer him. Atticus meant well, but he didn't understand. Ashfeld was just as much a home to him as Rome had been, but it was the principle of it all. When he was a centurion, he carried the pride of his men with him. He fought the enemies of Rome side by side with his soldiers and comrades. So to have them all dead, while he went on living, and without an empire to return to, even were Rome still standing, he had not his eagle standard. What on earth could he return to or with? His honor, just like his armor, was shattered. His pride, like his sword, broken. How can one lead with conviction when they lack the proper rooting? From there, Aurelius would travel Ashfeld for a few more months, meeting other brothers in arms, all with similar stories to tell. Once or twice a rumor would spread that Valeria had been discovered, but they all turned out to be false. Some even began thinking that the Empress was dead or captured. Aurelius feared for her, but knew that without proper resources, he couldn't hope to find her. 8 months passed since Aurelius left Crow's Peak, when suddenly, news reached him that he never thought possible. The Wulin had finally invaded Heathmoor. They were weakened, yes, not nearly the great and terrible force they used to be, but they had come nonetheless, led by the Emperor Gaule. Aurelius felt a stirring in his bones, a desire to see them again, to wage war against the wretched enemies of Rome that now threatened Ashfeld and all of Heathmoor, but not just for personal vengeance, no. He thought of Crow's Peak, ravaged, filled with the corpses he'd seen on the amber fields. He pictured the little villages burned and razed to the ground, children's laughter replaced with wailing sobs. The beautiful Queen Eleanor vanished just like Empress Valeria. Not again. Never again. That evening, a new warden took his oaths, and a phoenix at last rose from the ashes of defeat. Tian Shilong looked out over his next battlefield as he advanced his guards scouting the plains for safe travel routes. His heart was heavy, still lost in contemplation and pain. He rubbed the wound on his shoulder given to him by a young centurion years ago, and he grimaced. What a wretched battle it had been. But why was he remembering it now? Why did he think of that war now when there were other things to occupy his mind? The future of the Wulin, the conquest of his emperor, and the death of his beautiful wife. Why was he thinking of that man? That Roman? "Sir!" the scout shouted. "Look there!" Zhilong turned his gaze to the scout's cry and saw that his advanced party was being harassed and attacked. A knight, adorned in crimson and gold armor, with a phoenix emblazoned on his chestplate, was ravaging them as a wolf through a flock of lambs. As he watched him, the familiar sensation welled up within him. "He lives," Zhilong whispered. "Outstanding." The Warden Aurelius looked up to see Zhilong standing on the hill. He was out of reach, and Aurelius knew that he wouldn't be able to get to him before he withdrew from the battlefield, so they both merely stared at each other, and smiling to each other. Aurelius raised his sword. "Viva la Victoria!" The Phoenix and the Dragon would cross paths frequently. They would fight often. Never a clear victor, and never a clear defeated. It was as if they couldn't bring each other to kill the other, as if the other pushed the other onward. But these two titans became legend around all of Heathmoor. He became known as Aurelius the Phoenix, because no matter how outnumbered, how overwhelmed, even when death was almost certain, he would come back with a fire so fierce it burned the very air around him. Aurelius was no longer a commander of 100 men, for he fought with the spirit and strength of 100 men. That is the legend of Aurelius the Phoenix. Big thank you to Havok for letting me write this story about his Warden.